Hello and welcome. This is a webinar on finding, understanding, and using research about assistive technology to inform your practice. It's part one of a two-part series, and the next one will be next week on Tuesday at the same time. I'm Penny Reed, and I consider myself semi-retired. I no longer get paid to work full-time, but I love our field, and I continue to read and learn. And I have found that many people have said to me in the last year or so, well, there isn't any research about assistive technology. And you know what? There's a lot of research about assistive technology, so I've decided I need to share that. I started looking more intently at research a couple of months ago, and I've shared it in a couple of states and conferences, and I've had people find it useful. So I'm hoping you will too, and that together we can enjoy learning a little bit about the research that is out there in assistive technology. This week I'm going to talk more about research on assistive technology for students with more significant disabilities. And next week I'm going to focus a little bit more on milder disabilities. I'm going to focus on reading and writing next week, and I will also talk about some of the research on reading and writing for individuals with more severe disabilities. But this week we're going to look at a variety of tools. I want to start by just asking you a little bit about yourself. I'd like to know what you do, and if you would just fill in your primary role so that I can see who's out there today, because I only recognized a couple of your names. I need you to fill in your poll, if you can, to tell me what your role is. Administrator, AT specialist, OTPT, other, parent, psychologist, SLP, teacher. That ended up in alphabetical order, not any order of importance. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and look at the results. And we have 40% of you are AT specialists, good. 30% of you are SLPs, about 10% are administrators. We've got a few more filling them in, and that's terrific. Continue to do that, but it does give me a good perspective. A few teachers, I'm glad you could get away to look at this. And I hope it will be beneficial to all of you. I'm going to move on now. Thank you. I want to start with just kind of a big picture of why we need to know about research. And of course, the first thing is I think specific research can certainly help us with our decision making about whether to try AT or not, and sometimes which AT. It certainly, when we know that, it can guide our purchasing, but it can also help us set goals. Now, if we find that research shows us that using a certain tool increases, say, productivity for about 10%, we wouldn't want to suddenly set our goal for an individual student to be that it would be 100% increase in productivity. So it can give us some parameters to use in our planning for individual students. And it can also help us compare the results of what a student does with what we might expect. There's another aspect that you may not realize, and that is that IDEA asks us actually to use research in our planning and in our practice. In the final regulations, it says that our special education-related services and supplementary aids and services should be based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable. And as you may know, IDEA also specifies that assistive technology can be part of our special education, our related services, or our supplementary aids and services. So that says to me that we really should be aware of the evidence-based practice, the peer-reviewed research about assistive technology, and use it as we plan for and serve individual children. There's a lot of different types of research, and all of it can be useful to us in different ways. Certainly teacher surveys can be important, and I want to share one with you that may be useful to you. User surveys of people who use assistive technology can tell us something. And one of the things that I want to talk to you about today is reviews and synthesis of the research, because it is one of the quickest and easiest ways to get some basic information that can inform your practice. And that is usually a review of application and outcomes research, and that's what I want to focus on for us. The first survey I want to look at, it was about a need for training in assistive technology. It was done by Ashton, Lee, and Vega about 10 years ago, and it looked at teachers and what they knew about and felt about assistive technology. And now, when they set up research design, they usually go for the extremes so that we can see a difference. In this case, they looked at teachers who had 40 hours or more of training about assistive technology as compared to those who had none. It doesn't mean that you would have to do 40 hours of training with each individual teacher, but it was a way for them to find a difference. And what they found was that teachers who responded, who had over 40 hours of training, felt that assistive technology was essential to their students and should be part of their daily routine. And they felt comfortable in identifying and using assistive technology to ensure educational access. At the same time, the respondents without AT training stated that AT was not important to students, not critical that it be part of their daily activities, and that they were not personally confident in identifying and using assistive technology. I think a lot of you know that in your experience, but to me it's important to have this research to inform us that some of our time does have to be spent teaching teachers about assistive technology, or they can't do their job in the IEP meeting in their role of consideration, and they also can't do their job in comfortably using assistive technology in the classroom for part of meaningful activities. I saw the difference of this, and I see it regularly. I often consult with different states and different school districts, and in one case I had the experience of being able to look at the IEP data in a state where they used one program throughout the state. And I saw districts that were similar in size and similar in makeup of the district in terms of finances and the living standards of the residents. And I saw that in one district, 7% of the IEPs had assistive technology in it. And the district next to it, 40-some% of the IEPs had assistive technology in it. I don't think that was a difference in the students. I think that was a difference in the teacher's knowledge and comfort with assistive technology. And that really does make a difference in what they recommend and use. I want to talk a little bit about synthesis of research. This one was done by Kelly and Smith, and it looked at 256 research studies. And I chose this to emphasize because we don't have time in our daily practice to read 256 research studies. But you can find in your research journals articles like this where someone else has done that for you, and these are very valid and useful pieces of information. In this case, Kelly and Smith were looking at assistive technology for students with visual impairment. Now, they looked at all those studies and found only 2 that used a true research design, and they were both single subject. And that is one of the reasons that you have heard or have even felt that there isn't any research about assistive technology. A lot of the older things were not as well designed, and of course one of our problems is that we don't have a lot of students with any one specific characteristic in one place, and so we often don't have a control group. And so our research has sometimes not been included in reviews of the research. But fortunately, that's improved, and it is getting better, and you will find more studies out there. But you'll also find things like this where they really have done the work for you of looking at across a large number of kids, a large number of research. They eliminated all the studies that did not have control groups, for one thing. And what they found is that a large percentage of the literature consists of anecdotal evidence, but it's still important because they found some information in looking at this national study and these studies that were out there. The next one, also by Kelly, is a secondary analysis, and it's another useful way to look at it. In this case, Kelly looked at a 5-year study of students with vision impairment and did a secondary analysis looking specifically for AT. What Kelly found at that point was that assistive technology was not provided to a majority of students with vision impairment who could have benefited from it. Specifically, they found that up to between 59 and 71% of the students across the country who they believed could have benefited from assistive technology did not receive it over the course of that 5 years, and it didn't improve over the course of the 5 years. Now, this is almost 10 years ago, and I hope that we might find a different picture now, but it is important to look at these things. They also found that AT was more likely to be provided if parents were highly involved, and that doesn't surprise me. But here is one that's really critical to us. They found that AT was more likely to be provided if students were in a residential placement. And since most of our students with visual impairment are now served in local placements with itinerant support, that means that we really need to look closely at the training we're providing to our itinerant visually impaired teachers of students with visual impairments, I should say, and need to ensure that they have the training they need about assistive technology for students with visual impairment and that they're comfortable recommending it. And again, in that school district where that student is served, that enough of the faculty and other service providers know about assistive technology that it gets included in the IEP and used in the classroom on a daily basis. I want to start looking at some application studies. And I took this one, even though this is about high incidence, I'm primarily talking about low incidence today. I wanted to use it as an example. And in this case, they looked at a specific type of tool. They used inspiration software as an example of cognitive mapping software and questioned whether it could improve the grasp of critical information. Now, this was 3 students. And again, there's some people a few years ago when this was published who would have said there's no research about this because it was only 3 students and there was not a control group. They really treated it as if there were 3 single subject design studies here. And these were students in high school with behavioral problems and a learning disability in the area of reading. They looked at what happened if they introduced the use of cognitive mapping software. And these students were students who had difficulty working independently and often exhibited serious behavioral outbursts specific to avoid doing reading assignments. And as a consequence, they got a lot of teacher instruction just to keep them on task. Prior to the intervention with the inspiration software, the 3 students had poor knowledge of the content area and typically scored between 15%, below 15% on the chapter quizzes. They looked at both chapter quizzes and chapter tests. The quizzes were oral, the tests were written. They identified 20 key points in each chapter of this material and asked those first verbally in the chapter tests, in the quizzes, and then written in the chapter tests. After using inspiration, all 3 of these students started scoring above 75% correct on the questions, both written and oral. So it made a significant difference. And an unexpected outcome was that they liked using the software so much that they asked to use it to map the novels they were reading in their language arts classes. So sometimes we find unexpected information that is also helpful to us. But this is the kind of thing that we can find out by looking at the research, and it could inform us in terms of serving our students with high incidence disabilities in this case, and high school age. Just last year, there was a publication nationally that was from the Education and Secondary Education Act, and they said that we should look for at least one study to base our intervention on, and that we should look for strong evidence, moderate evidence, or promising evidence. I would rate the study I just talked about as at least moderate evidence, because all three of those students had improved performance. It was improved in several different ways. It was a significant difference in performance, and they chose to use that in another way in addition to the required way. So that's at least moderate, perhaps strong. It would be stronger if we could have a group. It would be stronger if we could have more studies. But that doesn't mean that a single study can't be useful to you if it's in a similar setting and with a population that's similar. So that's the second point that this guidance suggests, is that in state education agencies and local education agencies, we should be looking for studies that are based on a similar setting and a similar population to the one that we serve. Now, for many years, the What Works Clearinghouse has been the place where studies have been posted that we were supposed to look at and use as models for our choice of research to look at. Recently, they've started including single subject design research based on some work by Rob Horner from the University of Oregon. They found a statistical formula they could arrive at to have the same kind of conclusions that were equal in weight to group design now for single subject design. So I think you'll see more single subject design research cited and quoted and listed in places like the What Works Clearinghouse. And that's a good sign for us. I want to now focus on the use of assistive technology for students with severe disabilities and talk about a little bit about some of the critical issues that have been a block to using assistive technology in the past. Sometimes the use of AT was denied or not looked at by the IEP committee because they thought that there were prerequisite skills that kids needed to have or specific readiness abilities. There's also a belief that some types of assistive technology could lead to a child not developing critical skills. And I definitely want to look at that with you and cite for you some of the research about both augmentative communication and power mobility. And also there was a concern in the past for some of our students that was it worth spending that much money? And so let's go with that one first and look at what we can find. Excuse me. Joe Richley is a researcher that has done dozens and dozens of studies, mostly in the area of augmentative communication. And he found that AT has the potential to improve the quality of life for individuals with severe disabilities. And he looked across different types of assistive technology from low-tech to high-tech and found that all of those can make a difference. So that's one of the things we need to have in our arsenal as we talk to other individuals with whom we work about whether we would want to invest in assistive technology for students with severe disabilities. The answer is yes. It can make a significant difference, and it is worth doing. Another way to look at that is looking at this research by Browder, Wood, Thompson, and Rebuffo, and they did a large review of the evidence-based practice for students with severe disabilities and found that the evidence about assistive technology in these working with students with more severe disabilities was often woven into general research about teaching and learning and not specifically identified as research about assistive technology. But there is research evidence to support broad application of assistive technology with this population. And I'm going to provide to you a bibliography of all the studies that I talk about today and next Tuesday, and that will be sent out to you when you get your certificate of participation. This one is a free product that you can download and gives you some more specific information about this large body of research. They did say they found that most of the research looking at students with severe disabilities was about augmentative and alternative communication, but that it does indeed support the use of both low and high tech to teach AAC. Calculator and Black in 2009 also looked at a review of the evidence They looked at 102 published studies and identified effective practices for teaching AAC to students with severe disabilities. And what they found was that evidence-based practice for teaching AAC to students includes using naturalistic teaching, and that means that it's in customary environments for meaningful activities and hopefully on a daily or at least regular basis, not something that takes place in a segregated setting by one service provider. Research supports using a system of least prompts, where we are fading prompts, of training peers and teachers to use the devices. It's a critical piece. Teaching multiple modes of AAC so they have a system and not just one device. Teaching a single symbol for a variety of purposes as much as possible. And introducing the use of communication devices early in a child's life. And I'm going to go on and talk more about that and giving you some more resources for that. But there is a lot of evidence, and it supports using AAC, focusing on these strategies, and making sure you introduce it early. Basically, the research does support the use of AAC. The literature reviews I've already talked about by Calculator and Black and Richley suggest strong evidence for the use of AAC for students with severe disabilities. And it has clearly disproved the belief that persons with significant levels of cognitive disabilities could not benefit enough from communication devices to justify the cost. Remember, that was one of the things that really blocked the use of AAC for a long time. And this, you'll notice that these studies I've cited here are older. They're all about 20 years old. And there were a lot of them back in that time period. You won't see much research now on this question because it's been asked and answered. And I think that that's important to recognize. There's a couple issues I'm going to talk about that have really been asked and answered. And so we won't find more current research because it's done. There's nothing more to find out about it. And that is, no one should be raising the doubt that this child should have access to assistive technology because they have a severe disability. That's just not what the evidence tells us. What it tells us is that we should be using it. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the use of augmentative communication and its effect on developing communicative behaviors. I'm starting with this single study, and then I'm going to go on to a review of a lot of studies. But I like this one because Michael Bierman and his colleagues looked at general communicative behaviors, not just vocalizations, but they looked at gestures and vocalizations and words, and they investigated the potential for the use of AAC to decrease other communicative behaviors. They found that there was no evidence that the use of a voice output device decreased the frequency of gestures, vocalizations, or word use. Now, in this study, they used the term VOCA, which is voice output communication aid. That's a little bit older word. In some of our newer studies, you will see SGD, or speech generating device. But the point is that using any kind of a voice output communication device does not decrease the frequency of communicative behaviors. In fact, increases were seen for all children for one or more of the other communicative responses when they had access to a voice output communication aid. So as they used this and experienced the communication event, it changed their attempts to use communication in all forms. And it's a critical piece for you to know, and I wanted you to have that one. The next one is even more significant because it is a huge review of the literature. Miller, Light, and Schlosser in 2006 did a meta-analysis of the literature. They looked at everything out there, and they found 23 studies of high quality that could not be dismissed. They were excellent studies. It involved 67 individuals in those studies, ranging in age from 2 through 60. They were all subjects who had been identified as having intellectual disabilities, mental retardation, or autism. And the age of the study would depend on how that was identified. a more current study, you would see the term intellectual disability, but you have to look at the terms that were being used at the time. They specifically were looking for evidence about speech production before, during, and after the introduction of AAC. And what they found across these studies, it was there's no evidence of decreases in any subjects. Not one single one. In about 11% of the subjects, there was, in fact, no change with the introduction of AAC. But in 89% of the subjects across these 23 studies, 89% of them increased their communication, their use of speech. So again, it reinforces the fact that we are not going to stop the development of speech by using AAC. This is the most important fact that we all need to know because it continues to come up. I'm active on the QUIET listserv, and if you're not familiar with that, QUIET stands for Quality Indicators for Assistive Technology. The joke is that we call ourselves quiet, but we're never quiet. And it's a very large listserv with over 3,000 members across the world. And questions are asked daily about assistive technology, and at least twice in the last 2 months, someone has gone on there and said, I need the research about the fact that AAC won't stop this child from talking. It's an ongoing misconception, and it's true of our fellow service providers as well as family members. So it's something that you need to have handy all the time so that you can tell people what the research actually says. I just think it's so critical that we're not held back by these misconceptions when the research is so clear. Then I chose another one to share with you because it's about younger children. This one involved 68 toddlers. They were identified as having developmental disabilities, and each of these 68 toddlers had fewer than 10 spoken words prior to the start of the study. They used 3 different conditions. They had one group that got augmentative communication input, where the teacher or adult working with the student used an aided language stimulation technique where they showed them the picture or the symbol as they spoke, and they pointed to them when they were speaking, every time they were speaking to the child. They had a second group they called AC output, and in that case, the adult used a hand-over-hand technique with the student to help them use a speech-generating device where they were using symbols and touching buttons to activate a voice output device. And then they had a group that got regular speech and language therapy, just spoken only, no symbols, no use of augmentative communication. They checked their progress after 18 sessions and again after 24 sessions. Remember, these are toddlers. These are 2- and 3-year-olds with less than 10 words each. And what they found is that the use of AAC facilitates the development of speech better than spoken language intervention alone. This is critical. We have got to know that we need to introduce it early because it teaches that communication exchange and that use of language in a way that can't be taught if they're not experiencing it. A later study by Romsky and colleagues at Georgia State also found that parents' perceptions changed and were more positive when their child was using AAC. So hopefully this is critical information you can use in your practice. A couple of more along the same line. Sevick, Momsky, and Adamson found that augmented input and output using speech-generating devices resulted in increases in the child's communicative attempts and the development of some spoken words. And they used the term a few spoken words. I want to say, when they started to develop more language and having more vocalizations, it wasn't a burst of thousands of words, but it was an increase. And that's what we're trying to say here, is that the use of assistive technology will not stop the development of those skills. It will promote it. And that's the important information we need. Brady in 2000 also looked at training to use a speech-generating device, improved comprehension skills for 2 young children with severe intellectual disabilities. Now that's just 2, but I chose to share that with you because I think it gives us a little bit of insight into what was happening in those other studies and why there was more vocalizations and more use of speech, because the children were comprehending more. And so it's something that we need to do and do early to make sure the children have the experiences to develop their language that they need and not let their lack of speech hold back their development. Here's a couple of website resources for you that will have abstracts of those studies that I mentioned and several others. The first one is smartysymbols.com, and that WIL-AAC, that is not a typo, that is the URL. And the other one is speechdudes at .wordpress.com. Both of those have abstracts. They don't have the full studies. In the bibliography you'll get, I do have the full study resources, but you would have to pay for those in general unless you know someone that subscribes to the journal that it was published in. And I'll talk more about that next week, and looking at what journals are really significant, and really suggesting to you that you buddy up with some folks that can subscribe to different ones, because you certainly can't afford to subscribe to all of them. None of us can, but we do need to get access to them. As I reviewed the research, what I found is that there's a number of studies that look at the importance of communication partners and training them. In fact, they identify our greatest challenge as training communication partners. Some of the things that we do as communication partners are that we dominate the interactions. We ask predominantly yes and no questions. We take the majority of conversational turns, and we do that by decreasing the opportunities for our clients or our students. We don't let them initiate much, and sometimes we have them use their AAC in a very artificial manner. When we asked a yes or no question in the first place and they've made a sign or a sound that we know means yes or no to us, and then we ask them to show us how they do that on their AAC device. Well, that's not motivating, I would just be here to say. And we often interrupt their communication attempts, and what we do is we rephrase our question in a way that means they have to start processing all over again. So there's lots and lots of research about that, and I listed some at the bottom. You'll notice that some of those are quite old. The oldest one is 1985. Again, it's one of those things that's been asked and answered. You'll see some more recent things, and I'm going to show you one next, but a lot of that has been already determined, and so you won't see a lot of it. But if you want to improve the communication of your students who use AAC, you need to look closely at the behavior of their communication partners. I strongly recommend video recording them and having them watch themselves. It's not a fun experience to watch yourself interact if you haven't done that before, because we do talk too much and we do rephrase things and we do make it harder than we think we are for our students to respond. One of the best resources out there in looking at focusing on communication partners is from Jennifer Kent Walsh and Kathy Binger at the IMPACT program. And I've listed that resource here. That's a free download, and I checked all of my URLs this morning, so I know they're all still working. They point out that there's a need to model effective AAC use with our students, and absolutely critical is to use an expectant delay, so that we're waiting for the students to process, plan, and complete their response. They suggest asking more WH questions to prompt a higher level response on the part of the student, and using verbal prompting, so we show the student and tell the student what we want them to do, and they teach that in this material, and of course to reinforce communicative attempts. Really, researchers widely agree that working with communication partners is probably the most critical thing we can do. And in schools where we may have a number of different adults interacting with the student as well as their own peers, it's really something that can make a significant difference in the child's progress with their augmentative communication. I'm going to take a little turn now. We've talked almost totally about AAC here, and I want to look at a couple of other things that we commonly use with students with more severe disabilities. Cullen and Albert Morgan reviewed 36 different studies. Again, I'm focusing on these syntheses of research for you because you don't have to read every single one of those studies. Now, when you read a synthesis, what I find is I get interested in some of them and I do go read those other ones. But really, to get the research results, you can rely very much on these reviews. The other thing you can rely on is if it's published in a research-based journal that's peer-reviewed, they've used the right parameters. They've used the right techniques. They've used the right math. You don't have to know which statistic is the best one to use. You can rely on this. I've had people say to me, oh, I can't read research. I'm just terrible at math. Well, hello. I'm here to tell you, you don't have to know any math to review these and to understand them. You can look at these research reviews. You can trust that they have been reviewed by someone before they were published in those journals and that they've used the right statistics. You can go right to reading the results and think about how that applies to your students, and you can use your information about the age, the type of disability, the needs of your students to decide if this is a good match, as they're suggesting from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So in this case, they were looking at technology-mediated self-prompting for daily living skills. And as a whole, this body of research really demonstrated the positive effect of this. They felt that that meets the standards for evidence-based practice for adolescents and adults with disabilities. And they said that most of them targeted buying, preparing, and consuming food. And we kind of know that. Food is motivating, and we do a lot with food in terms of working with our students with more severe disabilities. Some focused on managing personal finances and managing a household and buying and caring for clothing. And that's where, when you read a synthesis, you may find that they've mentioned one or more studies that look specifically at some area that you're interested in. So if you were wanting to do something with personal finances with some secondary students with severe disabilities, you might want to pursue finding the 2 or 3 or 4 studies that they included in their review that looked at that specific thing because you might get some more specific information that you can apply. One of the interesting things is that they said that none of the studies reported on caring for personal needs, which is one of the things that helps our students become more independent adults. It didn't look at demonstrating relationship responsibilities, exhibiting responsible citizenship, utilizing recreational facilities, or engaging in leisure. So those are kind of interesting things. But they did find that technology is useful for self-prompting, and I'll look a little more at that here. Some specific studies by Lancioni and their colleagues a few years ago looked at picture cues presented on Palm Top, and these were all about 2000 when a Palm Top was our most current technology. I think easily you can generalize this to use of smartphones and tablets, but what they found is it was much more effective than pictures presented manually on cards. And again, I would not expect to see a current research study on this because it's asked and answered. We all know that it's more engaging to use our modern technology than just some cards or some signs on the wall. Davis, Stock, and Waymeyer looked again at personal computer systems with auditory prompts and text and found them much more effective than a traditional written schedule. So if you're wondering, is it worth spending the money to use technology with this student, I think we have that in our research, that it definitely tells us that. I also think that we have to make wise decisions. If we have a student who throws things or breaks things, we have to be very careful about what we recommend. We're certainly going to want that sturdiness, and we're going to want to put it in a case that isn't breakable, but it is going to be more motivating and certainly more engaging, and we know that our students don't want to look different than their peers, and all of our students now want to use technology. We have, I'd say, technology is pervasive in our environment, so that has sort of made our job easier in some ways. And Meckling looked at AT as a self-management tool, reminding us about behaviors and task performance, and we find that in general, they're all helpful to help individuals self-initiate, self-instruct, self-maintain, and self-monitor their behavior and their task performance. We know that picture prompts are effective in cueing multi-step tasks, and now we know that, yes, it's worth putting it on a technology tool. Other tech. This is an interesting one from a few years ago, where they looked at the use of adapted robots and found that increased social and language skills in children with cerebral palsy, so that they could operate them from switches, other ways, and get them to do things that helps. It makes sense to me that it would help with their spatial understanding, but it also increased their social and language skills. It resulted in an increased attention span in academic tasks, which I found very fascinating. I want to switch gears now from these to looking specifically at power mobility, because this is another area where we run into colleagues and family members who are afraid to use power mobility because the child will not learn to walk. And basically, for young children who are not learning to walk at the same age as peers, power mobility affords opportunities to engage in much more independent exploration of their environment, as compared to focusing exclusively on the remediation of their limited mobility. If you've ever been present when you put a young child into power mobility for the first time and watched their face as they experience that, it is one of the most exciting experiences of my life. I love it. It's a freedom they simply haven't had, and an excitement. And they all do something naughty, which I also found wonderful. Isn't that fun that they run away from you when you tell them not to, because they've never been able to do it before? Power mobility allows all children who are unable to walk the opportunity to express cognitive as well as social and adaptive abilities. And it's a wonderful freedom. Some research tells us that it allows spatial searching, spatial problem solving, and again, when we have students who are mobility impaired, that sense of spatial concepts is very hard to teach when they're not able to get around in their environment. It allows social and exploratory behaviors and visual tracking, another important aspect to their cognitive development. One of the things we know is that power mobility does not prevent walking. And again, we have research by several different researchers and found that none of the research has substantiated a commonly held fear that children will regress in motor skills due to the use of power mobility. It just doesn't happen. If anything, it increases their interest and excitement about exploring their environment. But the big issue, and I'm not going to have a good answer for you, is when to begin. The answer, like our common AT answer, is often it depends. There have been multiple studies, and I listed them here, and a lot of them are older because it's asked and answered. Yes, we can use power mobility with students less than 2 years of age. So we know that we can do that. The question is, well, when do we really start? I didn't find a lot of help for that question. There's different opinions, but there's not clear research. There were a number of tools out there that I found that someone had developed hoping they could determine readiness, and none of them have proved effective. One of the most famous and well-known people in the area of power mobility is certainly Kangas, but I found that Karen does not publish. I could only find one citation from 1997, and I could not get a hold of it. I know that she does a number of presentations and certainly has a vast experience with power mobility with young children, and she tells you clearly that it's important and we should use it as soon as we can. Any time children can't ambulate by the time their typically developing peers are walking, they should be considered candidates for powered mobility, according to Kangas. She also says that practice in familiar natural environments with meaningful activities and familiar routines promotes their learning better than block practice in an unfamiliar setting. I wish I had actual research to share with you for that, but I don't. But I did find some interesting studies that looked at parents' perception of power mobility, and what these researchers stated in both cases is while there was often trepidation on the part of the parents prior to the use of powered mobility because they were afraid it would stop their child from learning to walk, what they reported was increased independence, increased personal control, increased engagement by their child in meaningful life experiences, and a positive effect on others' attitudes toward their child. So these are all important things that happen for a child when we give them power mobility. They also stated that the use of the power wheelchair increased their child's confidence, motivation, and happiness, and reduced frustration. So I can't find research that tells you when, but I think the research definitely tells you go. In general, the research about AT supports its use. In their book on teaching students with moderate and severe disabilities, Spooner, Browder, and Mims found that research supports the use of AT in all of these areas for mobility, positioning, daily living, hearing, vision, communication, and instruction. We should be using it as much as possible. It makes a difference. In the report to the President in 2015, they stated clearly that access to technology is critical for people with intellectual disabilities to fully engage in the everyday life of society. It's important. I also looked just a little bit at AT in the workplace, at where our students are going, and I wanted to take a quick look, but it's not, I don't subscribe to a lot of journals in this area, so I certainly have not done a thorough review. But generally I found that the researchers found that AT was successful in increasing work performance of students, individuals, with intellectual disabilities in respect to productivity, navigation, time management, and task completion. And that was a very recent review. It was done in work settings that included libraries, restaurants, grocery stores, offices, cafeterias, and even an animal shelter. The technology they reviewed included handheld computers, iPads, iPods, smartphones, even a vibrating watch. So they were looking at a variety of things across their research. But unfortunately, the other thing they found is that AT continues to be underutilized. Just another study by Cullen, Albert, Morgan, and Sheila, they found prompting by AT was more effective than low-tech methods, and yet we're finding technology is underutilized. Sauer, Parks, and Hain found that AT results in increases in accuracy, independence, and generalization. So these are all critical. But, I'm sorry to say this, in a survey of clients, of AT users, or potential AT users, this was a survey of 158 service providers or caregivers that worked with adults with disabilities. Now it's 5 years old, and I hope that things have changed. But what they found was that the majority of the clients were not using AT devices, even if they'd been recommended to them and they had had them in the past. They were not using them to support their needs in these 8 areas they identified: home living, community living, lifelong learning, employment, health and safety, social, protection, and advocacy. In 4 of the 7 areas, at least 60% of the clients were not using AT devices as part of their support system. So even though we have wonderful hope provided by the research, we still have a long way to go to know that all the people surrounding these individuals will understand and value assistive technology. So what lies ahead? There's some exciting stuff out there with virtual reality and robotics. Think of the experiences we're going to be able to give our students. And brain-computer interface, and we've been hearing about that for more than 10 years. It keeps getting better and better. I wonder how soon we'll be able to capture a child's thoughts and go directly to actions when we want to. Some of those thoughts might not be things we want to go directly to actions, but to give them that opportunity to free them from the body that they're locked in is what assisted technology can do. And I think it's an exciting area that we're going to find more and more things happening. And I would urge you to start looking at some of the research and to share it with others so that you get the kind of support and understanding. And remember that you will definitely have to do training of other individuals. Next week I'm going to look at more high incidence. I'm going to focus on reading and writing. I will include some studies on reading and writing with some of our more severe disabilities also, but primarily high incidence. And the bibliography that you'll receive is the same one, so you'll get all the studies in that. I have some time left, nearly 10 minutes, that I can take questions. So far I haven't seen any questions. You can ask your questions via chat, and I would be happy to answer them. Let me know what those are. Now is the time. I'm going to wait a few minutes. I find reading the journals very useful. As I said, you do not have to be good in math to understand this. All of our journal articles end with conclusions and recommendations that are based on what happened. You don't have to look at the math if that's something that's holding you back. If you love the math, feel free to look at it. I vary in my days and when I want to look at the math and when I don't. I'm just going to chatter at you for a couple minutes. Okay, here. Inez Peterson says, did you say you would share the journals to subscribe to? I will. Next week in my slide presentation, I will have a list of the journals. I can just tell you, in case you can't participate in that one, in general, each of your professional organizations have at least one journal that focuses on research, but I'll have a list of them next time. Other questions. Megan Zell, where besides journals do you find research articles? Well, I would say journals are where I want to find them. Where I would not look for them are the websites of your vendors. Now, if you want to know some of the research that has been done by a vendor for their specific product and what they see as the strength of that product, then go to that vendor's website and you will find them. What you won't see there in general are really well-designed studies that were done in an unbiased manner. What the vendor wants is the research that supports their product. But I do go to vendor websites when I'm looking for specific information about the features that they have on their products and how they've worked. But basically journals are where you're going to find it. Ann Bowie asks, are there any resources you would recommend for us who want to develop community assessments around AT? How to develop quality questions in order to track data and outcomes. You know, off the top of my head, Ann, I do not know of any resources. Develop community questionnaires. I will try to think about that. If I find something, I'll share it next week, but it's not something I'm aware of. Lori Ritvo asks, is there evidence-based materials available for use to support instruction? Yes, and again, you have to read the research journals. If I will talk more about instructional strategies next week and specific things. The things we talked about instruction this time were in the area of AAC, and that a lot of the instructions specifically about training communication partners and other features in some of those free ones that I pointed out. But I will talk a little bit about reading and writing next week, which I assume is more of the instruction you're talking about. Those are great questions. Ask some more, please. I'm loving them. Okay, I'm going to reiterate. I think professional journals are the main place you will find research. You will find some on websites, and I would go to vendor websites when I want to know features about their equipment and their products. I don't usually find peer-reviewed research on vendor websites, and I'm certainly there are exceptions to that. I'm certain there are exceptions to that, but in general, you have to go to a peer-reviewed journal to find the research that has been reviewed by peers. You can also go searching. Go to Google Scholar and search on your topic, And you will find some dissertations and things that you can look at, and those are often very helpful. In that case, you have to have a little bit more knowledge about reviewing the design of the research, because a peer-reviewed journal hasn't done that yet. Megan Zell asks, are there any particular online databases that house research articles? Not specific about assistive technology that I know of. The What Works Clearinghouse is the main one out there, and there are some things in there now, but as compared to what there were a few years ago. I can work on that for next week also. Inez Peterson, so do you just say asked and answered when the research is 20 years old and you can't find any newer research? What to do when you can't find any recent research? Well, Inez, I think the question is there still a question? You know, I think the question has been answered is, can AT benefit individuals with severe disabilities? That's asked and answered. Can the use of augmentative communication devices help a student develop their speech and language? It's asked and answered. So yes, I do say that, and I would show that research. Some of that is seminal. There's no reason for someone to do it again. And I would say that about the literature review about AAC that I mentioned about Janice Light and her colleagues in 2006, where they reviewed all those studies about AAC and found that clearly it did not stop children from developing speech and language. In fact, it aided it. That is asked and answered, and I think you show them that research and you tell them, you know, this is seminal research in the field. It's not necessary to do it again. I hope that's helpful to you, because yes, I do say that. More questions. Those are great. Ariangelina said, are you familiar with the Informed SLP? This website reviews evidence-based research articles on a monthly basis. They currently focus on pediatric SLP articles, and it includes some AAC research. I am not familiar. Thank you. And so is that open to anyone, the Informed SLP, or do you have to pay for it? If you could type that in your chat, Ariane, I will tell others. I love to have new resources. Thank you. So I would Google, yes, some free reviews. Okay, I would Google that, folks. Try Informed SLP. It sounds like we found a good resource for you. Oh, monthly membership. Okay, Ariane says there is a monthly membership required, and others you need to pay for. And, you know, that's true. Some of the articles that I quoted to you, I've paid, often it's around $9 or $10 to get the article. And that's because it's in a journal that I don't subscribe to. That's why I think you need to make a lot of friends, and that each of you need to subscribe to different sources so that you can share with each other. It sounds like Ariane would be a good friend to make. Okay, we have 2 minutes left, but I think we're about done unless another question pops up. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope you're here next week too. I look forward to it. Goodbye.